The deed was a lie told on parchment. Honora Hollis held it in her hands, the paper cool and mocking against her skin. It smelled of dust and disuse, a fitting scent for the inheritance that was meant to be her ruin. It granted her, upon her 25th birthday, sole ownership of the Grey-Weather Quarry, a waterlogged pit on the farthest edge of her late father's diminished estate, a place so notoriously unstable and barren that not even the most desperate laborer in Marley would consent to work its crumbling ledges. It was, her aunt had just informed her with a smile that did not reach her eyes, all that remained of her dowry. The rest, the solid coin and government stocks, had been necessarily expended upon her cousin Felicity's third, and hopefully final, London season. "One must be practical, Honora," Lady Lavinia Vickers had said, her voice the auditory equivalent of watered silk, smooth, thin, and lacking warmth. "Felicity has prospects. You have the quarry." Honora looked down at the deed. She did not cry. She had learned long ago, in the cold years after her parents' passing had delivered her into her aunt's care, that tears changed nothing. They were a currency her aunt did not value and could not spend. Competence, however, was another matter. It could be endlessly spent, and for a decade, Lady Vickers had been spending Honora's with abandon. Her life was a study in invisible labor. It was Honora who kept the household accounts for Bramblehurst Park, a house that bled money like a consumptive. It was her precise, spidery script that filled the ledgers, tracking every pound and shilling, stretching the dwindling income to cover the grocer's bills and Felicity's insatiable appetite for new ribbons. It was Honora who knew that the West Wing roof would not survive another winter, that the cook, Hannah, was pilfering sherry, and that the only way to afford the seed for the spring planting was to sell off the last of her own mother's silver. She did this not from a desk in a sunlit morning room, but from a cramped, cold closet off the kitchens, a space that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and damp stone. She was a ghost in her own ancestral home, a silent engine of competence that allowed the glittering facade of the Vickers family to remain precariously upright. She wore gowns of gray and brown, twice mended and perpetually out of fashion, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that emphasized the thoughtful intelligence in her face rather than any claim to beauty. She ate her meals on a scrubbed pine table with the upper servants, her presence an accepted, unremarkable fact of their lives. They treated her with a quiet, watchful respect that was absent in the drawing room upstairs, where she was addressed only when a number needed fetching or a letter required a fair copy. This particular afternoon, the injustice was a physical weight in her chest. Not just the theft of her dowry, but the casual cruelty of its presentation. Lady Lavinia had positioned it as a kindness, a final settling of accounts. Honora was now 25, an old maid by the county's reckoning, and with no dowry, her marital prospects were grim. A local curate with more piety than pence, perhaps. Or a widowed farmer looking for a housekeeper who would not demand a salary. The quarry was the final nail in the coffin of her hopes, a stony grave for any dream of a life she might choose for herself. She folded the deed, the crisp edges sharp against her fingertips. She thought of the quarry, a place she had seen only once as a child, a gray, gaping wound in the earth, filled with stagnant green water and shadowed by skeletal trees. The local folklore claimed it was cursed, that the stone there was as rotten as a bad tooth. It was a place of endings, but as she stood in the cold silence of her little office, another thought, hard and clear as crystal, surfaced through the mire of her despair. Her aunt believed the quarry was worthless. The entire county believed it was worthless. But they were people who dealt in rumor and reputation. Honora Hollis dealt in facts. She kept ledgers. She knew the power of what was written down, of evidence weighed and measured. And she had never, not once, seen a geological survey of the Greyweather Quarry. No one had ever truly looked. The decision was not a blaze of defiance. It was a quiet, cold settling, like frost forming on a window pane. They had left her with nothing but a patch of ruined earth. Very well. She would learn the language of that earth. She would take its measure, just as she had taken the measure of this failing house. She would apply the only tool she had left, her own meticulous, unyielding mind. She placed the deed inside the worn cover of her personal account book. It was not a promise of fortune. It was a problem to be solved. And Honora Hollis was very, very good at solving problems. The catastrophe that befell the county arrived a month later on a torrent of autumn rain. The old stone bridge over the River Merk, the main artery connecting Marleigh to the wider world, crumbled with a groan of sodden mortar and fatigued rock. 2 wagons were lost. The disaster was compounded when the town's almshouse, its ancient timbers dried to tinder by the preceding summer, caught fire from a stray spark and burned to its foundations in a single terrible night. The county was suddenly fractured, its poorest residents homeless, and its commerce crippled. Rebuilding required 2 things the local gentry lacked in abundance: decisive leadership and good stone. The latter was the more pressing problem. The quarry, owned by Mr. Percival Trent, a landowner of impeccable manners and questionable ethics, yielded a soft, friable sandstone that was notoriously unfit for major construction. Yet his was the only active quarry for 20 miles. Into this crisis stepped its reluctant solution: Gideon Beaumont, the Duke of Kestrel Chase. A man made of silence and sharp edges. He had returned from the war on the continent a year prior, a widower, his grief a cloak he wore as surely as his severe black coat. He rarely left his vast, neglected estate, and when he did, he spoke in clipped economical sentences that stripped away the polite fictions of society. He was fabulously wealthy, immensely powerful, and utterly immune to flattery. He had agreed to chair the county's rebuilding committee out of a sense of duty, not civic feeling. The first meeting of the committee was held at Bramblehurst Park, a strategic move by Lady Lavinia to place herself and, more importantly, her daughter Felicity in the Duke's path. The drawing room was aflutter with strained gentility. Ladies whispered behind their fans, and gentlemen pontificated on engineering principles they plainly did not understand. Gideon Beaumont sat at the head of the long table, his face a mask of bored impatience, his dark eyes missing nothing. Honora was not present. She was where she always was, in the background. She stood by the door, ready to be summoned. When Mr. Trent began to bloviate about the surprising durability of his sandstone, citing a cost per ton that Honora knew to be inflated by a full 15%, Lady Lavinia waved a dismissive, jeweled hand. "The precise figures are of little consequence at this juncture, Mr. Trent. My niece keeps the books. She has a mind for such trivialities. Honora, fetch the regional survey ledger." Honora inclined her head and slipped from the room. The request was designed to show off the household's imagined efficiency,
while simultaneously reminding everyone of Honora's lowly, clerk-like status. She returned with the heavy, leather-bound volume and placed it on the table. As she turned to leave, the Duke's voice, low and incisive, cut through the chatter. "One moment." Every head turned. Honora froze. "Your aunt mentioned a figure for cartage from the Trent Quarry last year," he said, his gaze fixed on her.
She stated 3 shillings per ton. Mr. Trent's proposal lists 4. Which is correct? The room went silent. To correct her aunt publicly would be an unforgivable breach of decorum. To lie to a duke seemed a far greater folly. Lady Lavinia's smile tightened into a rictus. Honora met his gaze. It was not unkind, merely direct. An unnerving, assessing stare that demanded truth. "The contract price last spring was 3 shillings and 6 pence per ton, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The 4-shilling price reflects a winter surcharge Mr. Trent typically applies after the first frost." A muscle twitched in Gideon's jaw. He did not look at Trent or Lady Lavinia. He simply nodded, a minute gesture of acknowledgement. "Thank you. That is all." Honora retreated to her post by the door, her heart hammering. The exchange had taken less than a minute, but she felt as though she had crossed a battlefield. Later, after the committee had departed in a flurry of carriages and polite goodbyes, her aunt cornered her in the hall. "How dare you?" Lavinia's voice was a venomous whisper. "To contradict me in front of the Duke. You are a servant in this house, nothing more. Do not imagine your little display of arithmetic has elevated you." Honora stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her. "He asked a direct question, Aunt. I gave a direct answer." "You are insolent. You have always been." From the shadows of the main entryway, where he had ostensibly been waiting for his coat, Gideon Beaumont overheard every word. He saw the proud, still set of Honora's shoulders, the way she absorbed the tirade without flinching. He saw the venom on Lady Lavinia's face. He had seen generals berate subalterns with less vitriol. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the marble floor. Lady Lavinia started, her expression shifting instantly to one of fawning surprise. "Your Grace, I thought you had departed." Gideon's eyes were on Honora. "I require a final piece of information for the committee's records," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked directly at the older woman, but his question was for the entire room. "Who keeps the accounts for this estate?" Lady Lavinia opened her mouth, but Honora spoke first, her voice steady. "I do, Your Grace." He held her gaze for a long moment. It was not pity she saw in his eyes. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. "I will call again tomorrow," he said. "At 10. Be prepared to show me the full ledgers for the past 5 years." He gave a curt nod, turned on his heel, and was gone. The Duke's return the next morning was an event that threw Bramblehurst into a state of barely controlled panic. Lady Lavinia, assuming the visit was a pretext to see Felicity, had her daughter arranged artfully on a chaise longue in the morning room, a book of poetry open on her lap. But Gideon Beaumont had no interest in poetry. He walked into the house and, ignoring Lavinia's effusive greeting, stated his purpose plainly. "Miss Hollis, the ledgers." Honora was waiting in the hall, a stack of heavy, brass-cornered books on a nearby table. She led him not to the formal drawing room, but to the small, chilly study her father had once used. It was the only room in the house where she felt a sense of ownership, and the only one with a table large enough to hold the sprawling financial history of the estate. For 2 hours, he sat in silence, turning the pages. He was not merely looking, he was reading. He noted the dwindling income from tenants, the escalating cost of goods from London, the careful notations in the margins where Honora had cross-referenced expenses. He saw a story of managed decline, of a slow, desperate battle fought with ink and arithmetic. He saw the sale of her mother's silver, recorded in a single, unadorned line. Sale of plate, £112. Honora stood by the window, her back to him, giving him the space to conduct his examination. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was professional. Finally, he closed the last book. "You have a remarkable talent, Miss Hollis," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, but from him, they felt like the highest praise. "I do what is necessary, Your Grace." "Your aunt tells me you have come into an inheritance." He watched her carefully. "A quarry." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "The Greyweather quarry. It is considered worthless." "Why?" The question was sharp, a surgeon's probe. "The stone is said to be rotten. The pit is flooded. The access road is impassable." She recited the facts as she knew them, a litany of failure. He rose and walked to the window, standing beside her. He was taller than she had realized, and his presence seemed to fill the small room. He looked out at the damp, gray landscape. "My grandfather was a geologist, of the amateur sort. He believed the prevailing view of this county's bedrock was fundamentally wrong. He created maps, detailed ones. They are at Kestrel Chase, gathering dust." Honora turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued for the first time. "Maps of the quarry?" "Of the entire region." He had a theory about a vein of igneous rock, granite, that he believed ran deep beneath the surface, an intrusion that bucked the trend of the local sandstone. He marked a potential location. It was, as I recall, on the edge of the old Hollis estate. He paused. "Where the Greyweather quarry is located." Hope was a dangerous, unfamiliar sensation, and Honora pushed it down. "It is likely just a theory, Your Grace." "Perhaps." He turned to face her fully. "But I am a man who prefers evidence to rumor. The county needs stone, good stone. I am prepared to make you a proposition, Miss Hollis. A business proposition." She waited, her breath held. "I will provide the capital to drain the quarry and conduct a proper survey. I will hire the men and provide the equipment. The work will be done under your supervision." Her eyes widened. "My supervision?" "You have demonstrated a capacity for meticulous management. That is what this project requires. If my grandfather's theory is baseless, and the quarry is indeed worthless, you will owe me nothing. The loss is mine. If, however, we find usable stone, you will establish a price per ton, a fair price, and I will be your first customer. The profits will be paid directly to you into an account in your name." He stated the terms as if dictating a treaty. There was no hint of charity in his voice, only the cold logic of a transaction. Independence. The word echoed in the silent spaces of her mind. A life she owned, a wage for her work. It was a possibility so vast and dazzling, it frightened her. "Why would you do this?" she asked, the words barely a whisper. "Because I need stone, Miss Hollis," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And because I believe you are being cheated. I have a profound dislike of cheats." He held out his hand, not for a dance, not for a polite greeting, but to seal a bargain. "Do we have an agreement?" Honora looked at his hand. It was large, strong, unadorned, a hand that had likely held a sword, and now offered a future. She placed her own small, ink-stained hand in his. His grip was firm and brief. "We have an agreement, Your Grace." When Lady Lavinia was informed of the arrangement, her fury was monumental. "He is making a fool of you, and of us, giving you notions above your station. You will be the laughingstock of the county, playing at being a quarrymaster." But beneath the scorn was a sharp, acrid fear. The Duke's patronage, however eccentric, moved Honora from a dependent she could control and exploit into a woman with a sliver of her own power, a woman she could no longer so easily command. Honora ignored her. She packed a single trunk with her few plain dresses, her ledgers, and the deed to the quarry. The Duke had arranged for her to live in a small two-room gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of the Kestrel Chase estate, a mile from the quarry itself. It was humble, but it was hers. As she left Bramblehurst Park, she did not look back. She was walking toward a flooded pit and a madman's theory. But for the first time in 10 years, she was walking toward a life of her own choosing. The Greyweather Quarry was even more desolate than Honora remembered. It was a vast, gray amphitheater of rock, its floor submerged beneath a sheet of dark, unmoving water that reflected the sullen sky. Gnarled, leafless trees clung to the upper rims, their roots exposed like tangled nerves. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and decay. It was a place that seemed to actively resist human endeavor. The foreman the Duke had hired was a man named Jem, a former sapper from the Duke's own regiment. He was short, barrel-chested, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from weathered oak, and a profound distrust of anyone who wasn't in the army. He looked at Honora, with her mended dress and soft hands, and his skepticism was a palpable force. "The Duke's orders, miss," he said, his voice a low grumble. "But this is no place for a lady." Honora did not argue. She merely unrolled the Duke's grandfather's maps on the hood of the wagon. "The survey suggests the lowest point, and the best place for the primary drainage channel is here," she said, her finger tracing a line on the aged paper. "We will need 3 steam pumps. I have calculated the water volume. At full capacity, we can drain the main pit in 5 days, provided the pumps don't fail." Jem stared at her, then at the map, then back at her. He had expected hysterics or helplessness. He was confronted with logistics. A slow, grudging respect began to dawn in his eyes. "Aye," he said, after a long moment. "That's about the right of it." Thus began their strange partnership. Honora did not pretend to know how to set a charge or operate a pump. That was Jem's domain. Her domain was the why, the where, and the how much. She established their base of operations in the dilapidated quarry office, a one-room shack with a leaky roof and a broken stove. She swept it out, patched the window with oiled paper, and set up a desk with her ledgers. Each day, she was there from dawn until dusk, tracking the cost of coal for the pumps, the wages for the small crew of laborers, the depth of the water level. Her handwriting, neat and precise, began to fill the pages of a new book, the Greyweather Quarry Ledger. The work was slow and arduous. The pumps chugged day and night, their rhythmic coughing the only sound besides the wind and the cawing of crows. The water level dropped with agonizing slowness, revealing sheer walls of mud-slicked, fractured rock that looked disappointingly like the worthless stone from Trent's quarry. The men grew discouraged. The whispers in Marley grew louder. The Duke's folly, they called it, and Honora was its mad priestess. Gideon came to the quarry every other day. He would ride up on his large black horse, dismount, and simply watch. He never offered advice unless asked. He spoke mostly with Jem about the practicalities of the work, but his eyes were always on Honora. He saw her, day after day, in her plain brown dress and a pair of sturdy, borrowed boots, her face smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its pins, conferring with the foreman or bent over her ledgers. She never complained about the cold, the mud, or the back-breaking labor. One afternoon, he found her staring at a newly exposed wall of rock, her expression one of intense concentration. "Anything?" he asked. "It's all shale," she said, her disappointment evident. "Brittle, flakes at a touch, useless." He walked to the rock face and ran a hand over it. "My grandfather wrote that the granite, if it existed, would be deep. He called it the stone heart of the ridge. He believed the shale was merely a shell around it." He looked at her. "Do you want to stop?" Honora shook her head, a fierce, determined gesture. "No. I agreed to a proper survey. This is not yet proper." The next day, a wagon arrived from Kestrel Chase. It carried not just supplies, but a new, thick wool cloak for Honora, a small iron stove for the office, and a box of books on geology and engineering. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was his way of speaking, a quiet language of practical support. The quiet transformation was not just in the quarry, but between them. Their conversations, once strictly business, began to drift. He would tell her stories of the strange rock formations he had seen in Spain during the war. She would describe the patterns she was beginning to see in the strata of the rock. Then, on the 10th day, it happened. A section of the shale wall, weakened by the drainage, collapsed with a great roar, revealing what lay behind it. It was not more shale. It was a solid, seamless face of stone, of a color Honora had never seen before. It was a deep, lustrous gray, almost silver, shot through with tiny flecks of quartz that glittered in the weak sunlight like trapped stars. Jem chipped off a piece with his hammer. The sound was not the dull thud of sandstone, but a sharp, clear ring, like a bell. He handed the fragment to Honora. It was heavy, cool, and dense in her palm, its texture fine-grained and smooth. It was a piece of the Earth's core, ancient and unbreakable. "Granite," Gideon said, his voice quiet with awe. He had arrived just as the dust was settling. He was right. Honora looked from the stone in her hand to the massive, glittering wall. Her heart, which she had guarded for so long, felt as if it might break open. It was not just rock. It was vindication. It was possibility. It was a future, solid and real. She took a small, perfectly square-cut piece Jem had shaped for her and placed it on her desk in the office. It was a paperweight, but it was also an anchor. A reminder that even the most desolate places could hold a hidden strength. The Greyweather Quarry was no longer a grave. It was a treasure chest, and she held the key. News of the Greyweather strike traveled through the county with the speed of gossip. At first, it was met with disbelief, then with a grudging curiosity. When the first wagon loads of the silver-gray granite began to arrive in Marley, destined for the foundations of the new bridge, the quality of the stone was undeniable. It was harder, denser, and infinitely more beautiful than anything Mr. Percival Trent's quarry could produce. Architects and masons who came to inspect it declared it one of the finest building stones they had ever seen. Percival Trent felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His family had held the monopoly on local stone for generations, a comfortable and lucrative position. Honora Hollis, a dowryless spinster with a useless pit, was not supposed to be a threat. She was an object of pity, not a competitor. The Duke's involvement was a complication, but Trent assumed it was a rich man's fleeting amusement. Now, that amusement had unearthed a fortune and was threatening to ruin him. His first line of attack was social. He began to circulate rumors, whispered over port in gentlemen's clubs, and murmured by his wife behind her fan in drawing rooms. It was a sordid tale of a reclusive, grieving duke and a plain, grasping spinster. Theirs was not a business arrangement, the story went, but an impropriety. The Quarry was merely a cover for their clandestine meetings. Why else would a woman of supposed good breeding spend her days in a muddy hole with rough laborers? The whispers reached Honora in the form of averted eyes in the village and the sudden coldness of the baker's wife. She felt the sting of it, the injustice of having her hard work painted as something shameful. But she did not have time for their petty cruelties. She had orders to fill, wages to pay, a quarry to run. She held her head high and met their scorn with the same quiet dignity with which she had met her aunt's. When Gideon heard the rumors, a dangerous stillness settled over him. At the next county assembly, when a fawning acquaintance made a sly, jesting reference to the Duke's protégé at the Quarry, Gideon's reply was so cold, it froze the man's smile in place. "Miss Hollis is not my protégé," the Duke stated, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "She is my partner, the proprietor of the Greyweather Quarry, with whom I have a contract. Her competence and integrity are beyond question. I would advise you not to question them again." The public rebuke was devastating. The social attacks ceased overnight. Thwarted, Trent grew more desperate. He moved from slander to sabotage. One night, a newly hired labourer, his pockets heavy with Trent's silver, loosened the supports on a section of the upper quarry face. The resulting landslide was small, but it was meant to be a warning. It thundered down into the pit, moments after Jem, his old sapper's instincts tingling, had pulled Honora clear. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Honora was shaken, but resolute. She dismissed the worker and, with Jem, inspected every inch of the quarry, securing the walls. When Gideon arrived, his face was a thunderous mask. He saw her steady hands, her refusal to show fear. "This was not an accident," he said. It was not a question. "No," she replied. "It was not." His anger was a cold, controlled fire. "I will deal with Trent." "No, Your Grace," Honora said, surprising him. "This is my quarry, my business. The attack was against me. I will not hide behind you. We will simply redouble our efforts. We will succeed. That will be our answer." Her courage astounded him. He saw then that he had not rescued her. He had merely provided the key. She had unlocked the prison herself. It was this resilience that drove Percival Trent to his final, most audacious gamble. He could not compete with the quality of her stone. He could not intimidate her. So he decided to steal the quarry itself. He spent weeks in the county records office, poring over old deeds and surveys. He was a patient, meticulous man when it came to his own advancement. He found what he was looking for, a vague boundary notation from a survey conducted a century ago. It was ambiguous enough to be twisted. He hired a master forger from London, a man skilled in aging paper and imitating archaic script. Together, they created a masterpiece of deceit, a single forged page, which they carefully inserted
into the official county survey book. The forgery purported to be a clarification of that old boundary line, showing that a clerical error had been made. The land upon which the Greyweather Quarry sat, it claimed, had not been part of the Hollis estate at all, but had in fact reverted to the Trent family holdings in the year 1789. According to this document, Honora Hollis was a trespasser, and the silver-grey granite was, by law, his. Armed with this fabrication, he went to see Magistrate Ogilvy, the most respected legal mind in the county. Ogilvy was a sharp, sceptical man, but the evidence seemed unimpeachable. The survey book was the county's most sacred record. The page looked authentic in every detail. Reluctantly, he granted Trent a temporary injunction, halting all work at the quarry until the claim could be formally heard. The crisis broke while Gideon was in London, securing a major government contract for the Greyweather stone. Trent timed his move perfectly. He served the injunction papers himself, arriving at the quarry with a constable and an air of triumphant righteousness. He publicly accused Honora of fraud in front of her own workforce.
"This charade is over, Miss Hollis," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority. "You are trespassing on my land. Every piece of stone you have sold is theft." The news exploded through Marley. This was not rumor. This was law. The county, which had begun to admire Honora's tenacity, turned on her with breathtaking speed. That is how counties turn on their own, quietly, by degrees, and then all at once. She was a fraud, a schemer who had used the Duke's infatuation to steal another man's property. Her own aunt, Lady Lavinia, fanned the flames, giving tearful interviews to anyone who would listen, painting Honora as an ungrateful viper she had harbored in her home, only to be betrayed. Work at the quarry ground to a halt. The men, their wages now uncertain, drifted away. Honora was utterly isolated. She sat alone in the small stone office, the injunction lying on her desk next to the perfect square of granite. The silence was absolute. For the first time, she felt the crushing weight of despair. She had fought so hard, only to have it all snatched away by a lie. She did not cry, but the effort to remain composed was a physical agony. Gideon returned 2 days later to a county that had already tried and convicted Honora in the court of public opinion. He rode directly to Bramblehurst, where Lady Lavinia met him with a performance of sorrowful regret. "I am so mortified, Your Grace. I knew she had a grasping nature, but I never imagined this. To deceive you so." He cut her off with a single cold look. "Where is she?" He found her at the silent quarry. She was not weeping or hysterical. She was sitting at her desk, the ledgers open before her, as if she could find an answer in their neat columns of figures. She looked up as he entered, her face pale but her eyes clear. This was the moment of testing. He saw the injunction on the desk. He had heard the entire county's condemnation. He was a man who valued evidence, and the evidence of the survey book, by all accounts, was damning. A flicker of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his certainty. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked at the legal document, then at her. His face was unreadable, his voice devoid of warmth. "Did you know of this claim?" It was the only question that mattered. Her entire future, her character, her hope, rested on her answer and his willingness to believe it. She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it held the solid weight of the granite in the walls around them. "I did not." He searched her face for a second longer. 1 second. 2. He saw no deceit, no artifice. He saw the same unwavering honesty he had seen that first day in the study at Bramblehurst. And in that moment, his trust, which he gave so rarely and so carefully, solidified into something as unbreakable as the stone she had discovered. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, righteous anger on her behalf. "Then we will prove it," he said. It was not a reassurance. It was a declaration of war. "The truth has a weight of its own, Honora. We will simply place it on the scales." He said her first name for the first time, and the sound of it in the small, silent office was a promise. A partnership. They were no longer just business associates. They were allies. Together. Gideon moved with the swift, decisive strategy of a general deploying his troops. He did not challenge the injunction directly. Instead, he called for a formal public hearing before the full county committee, to be presided over by Magistrate Ogilvy. The venue he chose was strategic. The great library of Kestrel Chase, a room that radiated history, power, and sober authority. It was his territory, and it sent a clear message that he stood with Honora. The day of the hearing, the library was packed. The gentry of the county, hungry for drama, filled every seat. Percival Trent arrived looking confident and magnanimous, the very picture of a wronged gentleman seeking justice. Lady Lavinia, draped in black as if in mourning, sat beside him, ready to play her part. Honora entered with the Duke. She wore a simple dark gray dress, her only adornment the quiet composure on her face. A murmur went through the crowd. She looked not like a criminal, but like a woman prepared for a difficult task. Magistrate Ogilvy called the hearing to order. Trent's lawyer presented the case first, producing the county survey book. He opened it to the damning page. The forgery was, indeed, a work of art. The ink was faded, the handwriting a perfect imitation of the 18th century script, the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges. The lawyer explained the claim clearly and concisely. The Greyweather quarry land belonged to the Trent family. Miss Hollis was a trespasser. Then, Percival Trent himself was called to speak. He was smooth, charming, and deeply convincing. He spoke of his shock, his regret, his desire only to see the law upheld. He painted himself as a victim of a terrible error, and Honora as an ambitious usurper. Next came Lady Lavinia. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she gave her testimony, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "I took her in, gave her a home. I tried to guide her, but she always had a grasping nature. When she told me of the Duke's most generous offer, I had a terrible feeling. It seemed too good to be true. And now, alas, we see that it was." The room was thick with sympathy for Trent and Lavinia. Honora's cause seemed lost. Magistrate Ogilvy looked grim. He turned to Honora. "Miss Hollis, do you have a response to this claim?" All eyes were on her as she rose. She did not look at Trent or her aunt. She looked at the magistrate. She held no documents, no legal texts. "I do, sir," she said, her voice calm and steady, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Mr. Trent's claim rests entirely upon the authenticity of this single page in the survey." "That is correct," the magistrate said. "It is the primary evidence." "Then I would like to discuss the evidence of ink," Honora said. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Trent's lawyer looked irritated. "What does ink have to do with anything?" "Everything," Honora replied. She turned to the committee. "For the past 10 years, I have been responsible for all household accounts and correspondence at Bramblehurst Park. This included purchasing all supplies." Approximately 5 years ago, I became concerned that the standard iron gall ink we were using was fading in the older ledgers. After some research, I began ordering a new formulation from a supplier in London. It was a recent innovation, an ink that included a small amount of a chemical binder, gum sandarac, dissolved in the solvent, which made the script more permanent and resistant to fading. She paused, letting the technical details settle. I am the only person in this county who uses that specific ink. I have used it for every entry in the Bramblehurst ledgers since that time. She then looked directly at Magistrate Ogilvy. Sir, I have the receipts for that ink, dating back 5 years, and I would stake my life that the page Mr. Trent has entered into evidence, the page supposedly written in 1789, was written with that exact same modern ink. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. Trent's face had gone ashen. Lady Lavinia stared, her mouth slightly agape. "This is preposterous," Trent's lawyer blustered. "An absurd fantasy." "It is not a fantasy," a new voice cut in. It was Gideon. He stepped forward, holding a small box. "It is a testable hypothesis. I took the liberty last night of having a chemist from the Royal Society, who was fortunately visiting a neighbor, examine a microscopic sample from the page in question. He also examined samples from the Bramblehurst ledgers. His sworn affidavit confirms Miss Hollis's statement. The ink on the forged page contains gum sandarac. The authentic pages surrounding it do not. The page is a forgery." He placed the affidavit on the table in front of Ogilvy. The magistrate read it, his eyebrows climbing higher with every line. But Gideon was not finished. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice resonating with cold authority, "while Mr. Trent was busy creating false history, I was reviewing my family's actual history." He produced a slim, leather-bound book. "This is the personal diary of my grandfather, the 3rd Duke of Beaumont. He was, as some of you know, an amateur geologist. He was also a meticulous artist. On the date of June the 10th, 1790, he records a visit to the original Hollis estate to examine the rock strata. He complains at length about the poor quality of the county survey, and to illustrate his point, he made his own copy, a detailed sketch of the very page Mr. Trent's forger replaced. He opened the diary. There, on the page, was a beautiful, precise drawing of the boundary lines, clearly and unambiguously showing the Greyweather lands as part of the Hollis property. The date, the handwriting, the faded ink of the diary were all unimpeachably authentic. The case didn't just collapse, it evaporated. Percival Trent sat frozen, his mask of gentility shattered, revealing the panicked, greedy man beneath. Lady Lavinia seemed to shrink into her chair, the public humiliation a far more brutal punishment than any court could devise. Magistrate Ogilvy looked up from the diary, his face a mixture of fury and admiration. He fixed Trent with a glare of pure contempt. "Mr. Trent, you have not only brought a fraudulent claim before this committee, you have desecrated the official records of this county. You have committed perjury, and you have attempted to ruin an honest woman through lies and fabrication." He struck the table with his gavel. "This committee finds your claim to be utterly without merit. It is dismissed with extreme prejudice. I will be recommending that the Crown Prosecutor consider charges of forgery and perjury against you." He then turned his gaze to Honora. The sternness in his eyes softened. "And as for you, Miss Hollis, your aunt described you as having a mind for trivialities. It seems to me that your mind for trivialities, for facts, for evidence, for the simple, unadorned truth, has saved not only your own reputation, but the integrity of this county's records. Your diligence is not trivial. It is unimpeachable. The vindication was total. It was absolute. Honora stood tall, the quiet force of her competence having proven more powerful than all the lies and social maneuvering of her enemies. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had simply presented the truth, and the truth had been enough. That evening, the air at the quarry was different. The silence was not one of abandonment, but of peace. The injunction was lifted, and work would resume in the morning. Honora stood in the doorway of her small office, watching the last light of the sun catch the quartz in the great granite wall, turning it to a sheet of silver. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to see Gideon approaching. He didn't speak at first, simply came to stand beside her, following her gaze. The shared victory hung in the air between them, comfortable and profound. Magistrate Ogilvy tells me Trent has already sold his estate and plans to remove to the continent, he said finally. He will not trouble you again. And my aunt? Honora asked, her voice neutral. I believe the Society of Marley will prove a sufficient punishment for Lady Lavinia. She has been exposed. That is a kind of prison she cannot escape. Honora nodded, accepting it. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of justice, of scales being balanced. She turned and went back into the office, and he followed. Her gaze fell upon the small, perfectly square block of granite that sat on her desk. It had been her anchor through the crisis. Gideon walked over to the desk and picked it up, his long fingers closing around the cool, heavy stone. He weighed it in his palm. "This stone," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It will rebuild the Marley Bridge. It will build the new almshouse. The government contract I secured will see it used for the new naval offices in Portsmouth." He paused, turning the block over and over. "And it will rebuild Kestrel Chase." She looked up at him, surprised. "I thought Kestrel Chase was... it is your family seat." "It is a cold and empty house," he said plainly. "It has been since my wife's death. For years I have allowed it to remain so, a monument to grief. But it is time to let in the light, to build again." He looked from the stone in his hand to her face. "But I find I have no wish to do it alone." Slowly, deliberately, he went down on one knee. It was not the dramatic gesture of a suitor in a play. It was the solid, grounded posture of a man making a solemn pledge. He still held the piece of granite. "I did not offer you a partnership in this quarry out of charity, Honora," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "I did it because I saw in you a competence, a resilience, and an honesty that I had come to believe no longer existed in the world. I have come to value that integrity above all else, above wealth, above title." He took a breath. "I value you above all else." Her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, so tightly controlled, seemed to stop. "They say I gave you a worthless quarry," he continued, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "But the truth is, you have given me everything. You have reminded me what it is to build, rather than merely to endure. Honora Hollis, will you build a life with me? Will you be my partner, not just in stone, but in all things?" It was not a plea for rescue. It was a proposal of partnership, a plain-spoken declaration from one honest soul to another. Tears, which she had refused to shed in sorrow or humiliation, pricked at her eyes now in overwhelming joy. She did not need to deliberate. She had been solving problems her whole life, and this was the simplest, most wonderful answer she had ever known. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Together." He rose, and taking her hand, he gently placed the heavy piece of granite into her palm, closing her fingers around it. It was their foundation, solid, real, and built to last. 2 years later, the new Marley Bridge stood as a monument of silver-gray granite, gleaming in the sun. It was a symbol of the county's resilience, a testament to the stone that had come from the quarry no one wanted. Kestrel Chase was no longer a house of shadows. Its windows were unshuttered, its gardens tended, its halls filled with warmth and the quiet hum of a life rebuilt. The cold, silent Duke was gone, replaced by a man whose rare smiles were reserved for his wife, the Duchess. Honora, Duchess of Beaumont, was not a lady of leisure. She managed the vast affairs of the Kestrel Chase estate and the thriving quarry with the same quiet, meticulous competence she had once applied to the failing accounts of Bramblehurst Park. Her worth was no longer invisible. It was written in the prosperity of the land and the happiness of its people. Her cousin Felicity had eventually married a minor baronet with expensive tastes and was, by all accounts, perpetually short of funds. A partial reckoning. Lady Lavinia remained at Bramblehurst, a lonely queen of a crumbling castle, her invitations to county society now rare and grudgingly extended. One warm summer evening, Honora and Gideon stood on a new stone terrace at Kestrel Chase, a terrace built from the finest gray-weather granite. The air smelled of roses and damp earth. He handed her a small, heavy velvet box. She opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of dark blue silk, was the original, perfectly square-cut piece of granite from her office desk. It was now set in a simple, elegant silver base, transforming it from a mere rock into a piece of art, an object of contemplation. It was the first stone, the anchor, the proof. "A reminder," he said softly, "of where we began." She reached out, and her fingers brushed his as she touched the stone. It was cool and solid beneath her hand, a tangible piece of their shared history. She thought of the desolate, flooded pit it had come from, and the woman with nothing but a worthless deed to her name. She had not been rescued from that place. She had, with her own mind and her own hands, unearthed its hidden value and built a new world from it. It was not a fairy tale. It was something far better. It was real. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.